All right, hello and welcome. Today we'll be looking at the construct of personality, as well as comparing and contrasting personality to consciousness, as well as taking a deeper look into the dreamscape. And specifically with the dreamscape, we'll be comparing subjective interpretation of dreams versus objective interpretation of dreams. And we'll compare that to how that is situated within chapter 7, the dramatic structure of the dream. So let's jump in. We'll take a moment to just do a quick overview of what's ahead. All right, so as you can see, maybe you jotted down or you took a look, we're going to review from last week the animus versus the anima, as well as have a discussion on personality versus consciousness. And we'll do the 4 types of personalities that were inspired by Carl Jung's work and later became the foundational work for the Myers-Briggs, which is a 16 personality comparison across different expressions. So we'll take a look at that. And then at the end of our presentation today, we'll jump into subjective versus objective. All right, so last week was so exciting because we get into some of the really deep aspects of how our psyche becomes imprinted by our surroundings. So we looked at the construct of anima, which is more of the feminine form, as well as the animus, which is the masculine form. And I invite and encourage you to think of the anima as the aspect of passion and eros, and the animus as more about logos, reason, being logic. So you can even think about these two things as the right or left brain. And so here we can see that there is a sijinzi. And I know it's a really fun little word. So I have the pronunciation on the bottom of the slides. You can see it as S-I-Z, sijinzi. So it's basically the conjunction or the opposite of two things. So if we're looking at applying this to nature instead of sexuality or humanhood, we would apply it to the moon being in opposition to the sun, or day in opposition to night. And we also talked about the lover complex, parental complex, and archetype motifs. So if you recall from last week, we talked about moving from Eve as a symbol of sexuality, moving to more independence, looking at the symbology of Helen, who can take care of herself or fight, all the way to anchoring that spiritual identity and sense of purity through the motif of Mary. And we talked about how there's a progression through those feminine archetypes, as well as getting to what we call an androgynous archetype or neutral. And so the neutral would be Sophia of wisdom, who's often portrayed as a female or male, or just has androgynous characteristics, because that archetype of feminine wisdom encompasses and can hold all of these other aspects of a healthy sense of femininity. And the same is true when we're looking at the progression of masculinity in a Jungian psychology. We also talked about parental motifs and how very often our lover complexes are related to unmet desires that can occur through parenting, and they don't necessarily have to play out sexually or through a sexual preference. Rather, it can play out with just energetic needs. If you had a very emotionally unavailable father, you may seek out partners who are also unemotionally available. Or if you had a mother that was very enmeshed and very smothering, you may seek out partners that also perhaps don't have good boundaries or try to caretake instead of care give. So there can be a lot of smothering in the relationship that isn't consensual. So by getting in touch with our own parental complexes, getting in touch with our lover complexes, allows us to create a more clear sense of self. And if you recall from earlier slides, we have been working in the collective unconscious, the unconscious, the ego, as well as the self. And the persona is what gets projected out to the world. We also spoke a lot about shadow work. So we can see how the anima and animus, which is often associated with a gender expression of the soul, can absolutely be tied into shadow work. And so with our shadow, it's not that we're trying to negate it or dissolve it. Rather, we're pulling it in close and just allowing it, we're accepting it. And that is a big piece of how we work with shadow. All right, so that was our review from last week. And today we get to discuss personality. We'll discuss Jungian psychology as well as a few other ways that in modern medicine and modern psychology we understand the psyche. So here is a quote from Carl Jung. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both are transformed. So just thinking about even how a child can really be a teacher for a parent or an adult, or maybe even it's a scenario of feeling so much chemical reaction or kind of love at first sight in meeting something. These are all examples of the chemical exchange that takes place. And we know that to be true from modern science, right? Where epinephrine can get stimulated and released in the body if you feel intimidated or scared by someone. That's a chemical reaction. Or oxytocin, right? From giving a little human a hug, or, feeling their skin on your skin, or with new babies, they just have the softest cheeks. So again, that's a chemical substance that also gets released, and that's oxytocin to the bloodstream. So let's take a deeper look at what is personality. So this quote comes from Salm's work in 1997, and he's discussing the biologist Francis Crick, who's, pretty infamous. And he discusses in his hypothesis of the scientific search for the soul, he says, you, aka the person, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambition, your sense of personal identity, even free will, are in fact no more than the behaviors of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Wow, so that's a bit reductionistic, right? So your joys, sorrows, memories, ambitions, and free will, they're all just molecules that become associated. So that's one perspective, right? It's very biological. But another perspective from mainstream psychology is just that personality broadly describes characteristic patterns. So your personality is patterns, thoughts, feelings, and behavior that make a person unique. And so again, let's even tease apart special. I'm of the perspective that nobody is special, but we're all unique. We all have different experiences, because at times special can imply a hierarchy, like I'm more special or less special. So let's take a deeper look at personality by comparing it to classical conditioning. So within behaviorism or classical conditioning, there's a training technique that begins with naturally occurring stimulus that then elicits an automatic response. So often in Pavlov's classic conditioning study, it was a bell, and when that bell was heard, food was served, and dogs would salivate knowing what was coming, and then they were able to remove the food and still keep the bell, and the dog would still salivate. So what happens is a previously neutral stimulus can be paired with a naturally occurring one, aka saliva gland secretion. So what ends up happening, and we can apply this to personality with something like preference. You maybe had the experience that you like eggs scrambled and you do not like eggs runny or over medium because perhaps as a kid, the texture was uncomfortable if the egg was too runny. So then as this gets reinforced, personality preference can be, oh, I just like eggs, scrambled eggs, and nothing else. So we can see how a previously neutral stimulus comes to evoke the response without the presence of the naturally occurring stimulus, with our example of the eggs. And the two elements are then known as conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. So for some camps of psychology, there's also this idea that personality can also come down to just a set of preferences that are based on environment. So all in all, this boils down to kind of nature versus nurture. And I think that both have some credibility in them. And as we look at personality from Carl Jung, he took it a different way, looking at it. So some aspects here that he found were personality is organized and often consistent. We tend to express certain aspects of personality in different situations, and responses are generally stable. Although personality can be stable, we know it's influenced by the environment, aka nurture versus nature. For example, while your personality might lead you to be shy in one situation, like a social situation, perhaps in an emergency situation, you can be more outspoken. And then personality often is what causes behaviors to happen. So you react to certain people or objects in your career, or every aspect of your life gets impacted. So a quote from Carl Jung that he used to describe his experiments that he used when he was studying his clients was, one, that there are people who tend towards subjective feeling tones, and when they interact with their world, it creates more of a feeling tone state. And there are those reactions that occur in a more impersonal tone. So based on last week, which of the subjective versus objective do you feel like is more yin or yang? Yeah, I'm definitely thinking that the subjective and the feeling tone has more yin energy, a bit more feminine, a bit more receptive. And the impersonal or more rational objective tone in a personality is going to be more yang. So this gets us into another important aspect of, as we're looking at yin-yang theory and Taoist theory and more transpersonal psychology for Carl Jung, he wasn't just inspired by European biological models of the human psyche and personality. He was very inspired by Eastern and other worldly models. So I think it's important that we bring in the aspect of consciousness. So Carl Jung suggested that the psychological types, he understood there to be four, and we're going to unpack these a little bit more. But he named these four functions of consciousness as sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. So it's important to note that these terms did not originate with Jung. Rather, they were inspired from previous physicians, philosophers. So he was looking at Hippocrates and really studying various aspects of Christian van Wolff or Thomas Reid, so other great philosophers, and he became very interesting in how consciousness expresses itself. So we can see that, for instance, philosophers can distinguish between access and phenomenal consciousness, levels of consciousness, creature and state consciousness, transitive, and interactive consciousness. And while it's not important to get into all of them, I think it is important to note that Carl Jung saw personality types as an expression of consciousness. So within Buddhism, there's several layers of consciousness, and that includes the mind, the sense, the storehouse of consciousness, and the manas. And the intention or goal using dream psychology or the Bardos dream state in alignment with our waking state is to expand the true self. And by letting go of previously held perceptions of who they were, right? So this is what monks were doing and still are doing, is practicing expanding the true self to let go of previously held perceptions of self. I'm going to do a little bit more expansion, and we'll look at these as we progress through our slides. But there's 9 levels of consciousness. And when we're looking at, if you will, level 1 consciousness, which is level 1 through 5, 1 to 5 is basically the 5 senses. So eyes is visual stimulation. Level 2 of consciousness is hearing, auditory. Level 3 is olfactory stimulus. Level 4 includes tasting or the tongue, and that's very biological in how we digest our world. That aspect of consciousness is level 4. And then in level 5, it's anything related to the physical body or touch, and so we call that tactile stimulus. So consciousness expresses its way through this, and as we apply consciousness and awareness to a dream state, how level 5 really comes up is through enactment. So if you recall from chapter 4 in Whitman's book, enactment is how the body is physically reacting to physical sensations in the dreamscape. For example, if you're dreaming, you're playing guitar on stage, maybe with your hand, your fingers, and your metacarpal bones are doing the same motions and same rhythms as if you were actually playing. Or if you have someone who's having a really scary dream, you might wake up with night sweats or your fist in a ball. So that is how consciousness, even though you're not awake, is expressing on the lower 5 levels of consciousness. And so tapping into the sense consciousness, which we described as, level 1 through 5, and it goes up to 9 levels, is really going to be getting in tune with our body. And that's why somatic work and somatic embodiment is so important, and allowing our body to leave, because it's the primary foundation that consciousness expresses itself. And so as we get into this discussion of personality beyond just modern psychology, we see that we enter into level 2 or stage 6 of the 9 types of consciousness, where we're in a mono state, which is perception of the self. And so through levels 1 through 5, we have a narrative about personality and perception that becomes a storage house for perception and personality in this life. All right, so I hope that's helpful, thinking about the 9 levels 9 levels of consciousness and how the body fits into that. So for Carl Jung, he was inspired very much by thinking, feeling, and sensation as ways that consciousness takes hold. So he says on sensation, that sensation tells us a thing is a thing. It tells us what a feeling is worth. Now, what else could there be? He says, one would assume that one has complete picture of the world, knowing there is something. What is it and what it's worth, what it feels like? But he added, these categories have to come from somewhere, and they have to go from somewhere. So for him, sensation was very much the bodily saying, the physical reaction, and intuition came from the unconscious state that emerges. And for Carl Jung, thinking was more of the logical aspect, more yang, and then feeling was a bit more yin in his assessment. And he believed that these states of consciousness were primarily held in the umbrella of extrovert, so outward energy, versus introvert, more inward energy. And then the thinking and judging, we can also see that, or rather thinking, perceiving, the judging as being more analytical, putting things into category, and the perceiving being more attached to a feeling state and perception. So he believed that these combinations could work together and you would get a certain typology of a person. So the scheme is the basic model for differentiation of the 8 function attitudes that people can have. Extroverted versus introverted. And really, this became a bedrock foundation that many others would build on. So Meyer in 1955, Henderson in 1970, all use this base of these 4 types to create personality systems. And so the most common one that's used today in psychology is called the Big Five, and that comes from Jungian psychology, as well as the Myers-Briggs. And so he goes on to say that these energetic aspects of consciousness often carry archetypal figures that carry over into the functions of other aspects. So I think we can all get a sense of introvert or extrovert, but I want to point out that I feel like when I read a lot of these, I kind of feel down the middle. So just reminding you that this is a spectrum. It doesn't have to be all the way to the left or all the way to the right. It doesn't have to be a polarity. Rather, maybe you embody some attributes of introspection. Maybe you embody more attributes of extroversion. So I'll give you a moment just to look at the list before I go through it. So for introvert, here's some key traits. You need it quiet to concentrate. So that makes you reflective. You are very self-aware. You generally need time for decisions. You feel comfortable being alone. You don't love to work in a group. Alone work feels better. And you tend to write more than talk. And you feel really tired after being in a crowd. So just give it a go. Kind of think about you personally, what resonates. I know that I definitely get tired being in a crowd, and that is because I carry a lot of intuitive energy. But I do prefer to spend time in a group, and I actually really enjoy and appreciate being alone. So for introverted characteristics, it's not a big polarity, but you may embody a few things from introversion and a few from extroversion. So let's take a look at extrovert. Extrovert enjoys social situations and settings. You don't want to live alone, and you don't want to be alone for a long time. You thrive around other people. You're a friend of many folks, and you definitely prefer to talk out problems versus thinking alone. You're outgoing, and this often is optimistic too. You're not afraid of risks, and you're flexible. So again, just kind of going through the list, seeing what resonates for you. And again, and you may have a few on this list and a few on the other. Great. So as I mentioned, these 4 states of consciousness that get expressed as personality became the 4 categories that get assigned to 2 traits in each category that we know today as the Myers-Briggs personality test. There's still some debate on and question that remains whether these types of personality types are accurate for behavior and intention, or if they're just useful for helping decision-making tendencies. And in my perspective, not everything needs to have scientific validity because it's important to note that science, despite all of its great tools and research design, still has limitation, right? How do we measure the soul, right? That's a difficult thing to measure. Or we know with the construct of mentalism, um, researchers in 1978 through a French organization studied quantum physics and found that you can have an impact on thought patterns. So if you hold a positive charge or a positive thought about an object, you can change the photon composition of an object, the chemical composition, through thought alone. So we absolutely know that thought and experience gets projected out into the material world. And that's an example of how hard science and modern physics can create a bridge between understanding some of these spiritual frameworks found in consciousness, found in Buddhism. But again, we may not have the whole picture because as the users of an instrument, aka humans, we have so many limitations in our own perception. So again, there might still be some inaccurate tendencies within the Myers-Briggs, but I don't think we need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. And it can be a really useful tool for self-inquiry and self-study. So if you're interested in the Myers-Briggs, you can definitely take that online. All right, so objective versus subjective. So as we're getting into dreamscape, I think that really takes us to the other layers of consciousness. I mentioned there was 9, and I discussed 1 through 6 so far. So as we're talking about the dreamscape, where we have access to these deeper layers of what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious or our personal unconscious, we're actually getting into the other 9 types of consciousness. So layer 7, you want to write this down, I'll go a little bit slower, but layer 7 is called manas, and it's self-consciousness. So it's the idea of your personal repository of past feelings, thoughts, actions, childhood self. So IFS, or internal family systems part work, has become very popular in the last 10 years. And part work is basically going back to a childhood self that's 8, or going back to a high school self who's maybe 15, and checking in with what that part requires to feel integrated into the psyche now. We definitely do that with shamanic work, and I prefer a more shamanic approach to family systems or part work, because I think it's important to note that there's also the repository of the full collective unconscious. And so we could be tapping into that as well. So level 7 is going to be your personal mana, your personal repository of self-consciousness. And then level 8 is repository consciousness that includes reflective awareness. And then level 9 is like Buddhahood. So we're talking about free from all karmic impurities. So I'm going to repeat those from the beginning just so you have them all together in your notes or in your mind as we kind of go forward into this subjective objective discussion. So 1 through 5, senses. And then 6 is going to be more perception with consciousness based on the senses. And then level 7 is your mana, or your own self-consciousness. And then 8 becomes the repository of reflective awareness. And then 9 is free from all karmic impurity. So we're thinking Buddhahood for that one. So repository consciousness is another way that we could say psychic stratum. In my perspective, it's also another way we could say collective unconscious. So as we're getting into dream state, we have access to these higher levels of awareness to level 6, which is understanding the physical senses in a dreamscape. And so we can do that through um, analyzing motifs, through amplification. And if you remember what amplification is in dream, it's basically the notion of you going to a funeral and maybe you were a little sad about the death, but it gets amplified like on a microphone or on a speaker system because everyone else in the group feels the same way. Same is true of if you have a dream about perhaps being a sexual object, and then Marilyn Monroe shows up in the dream as another echoing or larger amplification of that archetype, then that makes it even louder. So amplification tells us kind of what is happening with our personal consciousness in level 5 and 6. And so that is why when we're looking at dreams, it's helpful to have other people observe our dream or discuss it with us. But it's so important that we don't give away our own ability to discern the dream, because the subjective awareness comes through as we access these deeper layers of consciousness. So the subjective level is what you believe the dream symbols mean. And the objective level is things like consulting a dream dictionary or going to some textbooks or past PowerPoints on Jungian psychology and looking up the 12 different archetypes and seeing what motifs those hold for you. So again, with the objective, it's looking at an outer source, a dream dictionary, a tarot card or tarot deck, your notes from class to explore what a symbol might mean in a dream. And then with the subjective, it's that self-trust, it's the checking in of noticing, was there amplification in the dream for me? Or was there a bodily function in the dream, like my hands got really tight or feeling state? And so we use this dance of objective and subjective to analyze our dreams. So Jung himself believed that the purpose of a dream was to do one of two things, and that was to compensate or complement. So again, as we're analyzing, we can ask, are we compensating for something? Is there something we're missing? Or are we trying to complement a conscious orientation? Okay, so let's give a dream some application here. So let's say you have a dream, and I'm going to invite you to write down 3 objects of images that stood out to you the most. And an object can be loose in orientation. It doesn't need to be like a mug or a bed. It can be even a person can be an object. So take a moment to think about a dream that was recent and write down 3 objects that stood out to you the most. So I'm going to bring in a dream and share as an example, but of course, as we're doing this activity, I invite you to analyze your own. So a dream that I had, and some of my dreams are very prophetic, meaning they have a feeling tone to it that's really amplified and really important. So again, you want to check in what type of dream. If you remember, there's 6 different types. So it could be nightmare, could be processing dream, dreams of daily habits, what you're doing. So you want to start off there and then write down 3 objects that stood out the most to you. And then you can ask a partner, or there's a ton of Jungian therapists who do dream work, what stood out to them. And then as we're doing the objective piece, you get to consult mythology, archetype, folklore. And then as we're doing the subjective exploration, you get to explore what the symbol means to you personally. And I invite you to notice what level of consciousness is coming out through the dream. So I'm going to give you a few moments just to either think through this or to write it down. All right. So I was going to do a personal dream, but I feel like let's do a case study because this dream that came up is really interesting, and your perspective would be fascinating to hear. So let's go for something a bit more juicy. There was a dream of a client, and of course, so important to ask for consent before you share anything. So I have consent to share this. And in the dream, this person was in their parents' house. It was an old house, and they saw their parents outside the door. And there was a little boy who was 8 years old. And when he went into the living room, there was this dark, shadowy figure that was kind of in the corner of the room, but he was distracted by a shard of light, like a really thin shard of light just coming through the floorboards. And this little boy got a crowbar and decided to open up the floorboards to see what was there. Okay, so some content warning. It does get a little dark, so that's coming. If you choose to mute me, that's fair. um, and so as the floorboard starts getting cracked open, all of a sudden, all of these bugs start coming out. There's just like a larva fleeing everywhere. And behind the larva outcrops this giant cricket insect creature. And that's not even the scary part yet. As the cricket creature moves over and the bugs are fleeing, behind that is a body that is taped to a couch that's been decaying for a long time. After this, seeing this body, the individual wakes up. Okay, how do we analyze this? Right? And it's like, oh my gosh, I've been prepping for this the whole class, and now that it's here, what do we do? Yeah, so we can start with just writing down some images that stood out to you. So in this dream, what stood out to me was the little boy, also like the hidden nature of a body, that stood out to me. And then the other thing that stood out was the metal crowbar. And you can see how what stood out to me may be different than what stood out to you. But with this, it's an art form, it's not a science. So bringing your own art and perspective into this is very helpful. So we can consult a dream dictionary to look at a little boy, and some dream dictionaries, depending on the age or the feeling tone, that it can be a symbol of transformation, purity, or change. When we look at bugs in a dream, subjectively, that can also be a sign of change because the larvae were actively hatching. So there was a change. And then when we look at metal or crowbar, metal through Chinese medicine and objective has to do with the lungs and large intestine. So that's very much related to grief, grieving something. And so as I asked the person to come up with their 3 objective things, we also discussed the feeling tone. So what do you think the feeling tone might be? Maybe you guessed like scary or disgust, but for the person that wasn't the feeling tone was excitement that something that they knew was always there was finally coming up to the surface. Yeah, so that might be different than what you expected, something coming up to the surface. And with all of that, then we get to dig a little bit deeper, right? So we can ask parallel questions. What were the feeling tone of the dream? Do you have any parental complexes, right? We talked about that last week. Were there things in your family story that maybe were hidden or metaphorically swept under the rug or swept under the wooden floor? And the person really resonated with this metaphor. And what was interesting is what stood out to them for their subjective were very different than mine. We both agreed on the little boy and the body, but the wood element was more important than the metal element. And wood element, again, is all about growth, generation, springtime, new beginnings. So even though the dream took place in this very dark place, they didn't name the dream as a nightmare, but rather as a prophetic dream. And the feeling tones were actually more positive because something that was very old and dusty and potentially related to family secrets being swept under we're finally having time to express itself. So there is an example of some dream analysis with the previous skills that we've worked with. So just a little recap of some of those skills. We've talked about the dream ego, developmental possibilities through dream work, which is also called parts work, IFS, internal family systems. So in this case, we could have explored with the client, well, what was your life like around age 8 or 9? We could have explored the dream ego. Were you the little boy, or were you watching the little boy? We could have also explored the language of dreams, which we did. What images stood out? Were there any other allegories or stories or symbols that felt important? And then, of course, we take a deeper look at feeling tones, bodily reactions, amplification. And then today, we echoed in on objective versus subjective levels of a dream. And through all of these tools, we are using the structure of a dream to help bridge consciousness in a dream state with a waking state. So with that big intention being named of just alignment in our dream world to our waking world, I just wanted to end with some quotes. Our 6 senses create the perceptual world we live in. The senses and their corresponding sensory inputs are often called what Buddhist texts or Buddhists say, the vihikas, or the I in the form of objects. This is called the all. It is said in the text, classic Buddhist texts, by directly knowing and fully understanding the all, by developing dispassion towards it and abandoning it, one is capable of destroying suffering. So again, when we look at personality, we can get very caught up in thinking that we're a person. And that personhood can come from nature or nurture. We notice with operant conditioning that we can definitely be reinforced to have certain preferences or certain likes based on our family of origin, or how we liked our eggs as a kid, or languages or language spoken in the home. But Carl Jung believed that we incarnate, we have imprints of certain archetypes, and so we're the fusion of these two things. However, but by knowing it, aka the personhood, and abandoning it, one is capable of destroying suffering. So again, we kind of tap in and tune in to what our preferences are, what our shadow work is as a person, and then we also have to abandon it and have a neutral stance of dispassion towards personhood as a way of being capable of destroying suffering. So it's like we step into the plotline or the story of who we are, and then we step out of it. And the stepping out of it is how we're able to destroy suffering. So with that said, any dreams that are coming up for you, I invite you to write them down and get excited about what your consciousness is trying to tell you. And you know that consciousness has different definitions, but we're using the 9 types of consciousness from Buddhist texts. So today we did a recap of the animus and animi. We talked about personality versus consciousness, and personality as an expression of consciousness. We spoke to Jung's 4 types, as well as looking at application of subjective and objective dream work as part of the dramatic structure of the dream, which is chapter 7. So if you're interested in reading more about dream structure, that's there for you. And I'm looking forward to jumping into more mythological motifs, as well as time sequencing and creating inner awareness. So I hope you have a beautiful rest of your week. Some citations and references at the end if you're interested in more reading. Have a beautiful rest of your day.